So this podcast is all about the benefits of active play. But in today's episode, we're going to talk about a kind of play that makes a lot of adults deeply uncomfortable. The heights, the leaping, the jumping, the speed, those moments as a parent on the playground or in the forest where you're somewhere in between yelling, "Be careful," or pausing purposefully. So we'll talk to Dr. Mariana Brussoni today, who has dedicated her career to proving that this type of risky play is not only beneficial, but it's actually essential to proper and optimal development for kids. Welcome to the Active Play Everyday podcast powered by Next Playground. I'm your host, Dr. Emily, pediatrician, mom of three, and childhood wellness advocate. This show is about one simple goal: helping your family find a realistic path to 60 minutes of active play every day. No guilt, no pressure, just finding what works in real life. The information shared here is for education and inspiration. It's not medical advice. Always consult your healthcare provider for guidance specific to your family. All right, let's get moving. So Mariana, thank you so much for joining us today. And if we could start right out, what is risky play? So just tell us, what do we mean when we talk about this and how should we think about it?
Yeah, happy to. So the definition we use in the academic literature is play. It's thrilling and exciting forms of play where kids engage with uncertainty and there's a chance of physical injury. And each component of that definition is there for a very specific reason. So the thrill and excitement comes from kids pushing themselves beyond their typical limits, maybe climbing that bit higher, going that bit faster down the hill, or those sorts of things. Which gives them a kind of a tickles in my tummy kind of feeling, where they engage with uncertainty. So they don't know what's going to happen. Could be good, could be bad. And that's really the main point, right? And I think this aspect of it is part of what drives adults crazy, because we want so much certainty and safety when it comes to our kids. And the last part is where there's a chance of physical injury. And the point here being that kids are moving their bodies in ways that they haven't in the past, or extending themselves further. And so it's a physical play, which does involve risk of injury. And so part of what I've done in my own research, because I come from an injury prevention background, is to figure out how big is the risk of injury. And really the bottom line is not that big. And it's certainly a lot less than other things that we worry a great deal about.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And those who have been following know that the majority of my clinical work is in the pediatric emergency department. And then, friends and family know that with my 3 young children, I actually allow way more risk than folks would imagine. And I think it's because I see this value of risky play. And I sort of maybe have a better sense than others just seeing what sort of injuries come into the emergency department, which we'll get to later, about where we actually do see the injuries. Tell us, what do we know about what's happening with the brain and why risky play is so important for children and their brain development?
Yeah, and this is, I think, some of the most fascinating new research that's been coming out. And I really want to do a shout out to my colleague Helen Dodd in the UK, who has done so much of this groundbreaking research. She's a clinical psychologist by training, and she uses risky play to try and support kids with anxiety to reduce the symptoms of anxiety and that sort of thing. So why is that? And that's really quite fascinating. So if we return to the definition of risky play, the thrill and excitement, right? Those are very, very strong emotions that have bodily components to them. And so part of what risky play does, and what play in general does, it's like microdosing real life. And so in the case of risky play, what you're microdosing is risk, danger, and also those strong thrill and excitement kind of feelings. And so what often happens with kids who tend towards anxiety or can build anxiety over time is that the new stimuli, the uncertainty that's built into risky play is perceived as a threat, as something to pull away from, and to not engage with, rather than something to lean into and see as thrilling and exciting. And so what you have in risky play is, and kids, when they're allowed to play the way they choose, you can see it's kind of like, in psychology speak, cognitive behavioral therapy that they do on themselves, because, they go a little bit higher or a little bit faster, and they test it out, and they kind of figure out how far they're willing to go before that thrill and excitement kind of teeters into, oh, this is just a bit too much for me, right? So they really get to know themselves and their body, and they get to know that those feelings of kind of uncertainty, the experience with uncertainty, can be a very positive thing, something that is worth leaning into, rather than something that triggers the fight or flight response, which would lead them to reject that experience.
That's so powerful. And I can imagine that sort of learning this behavioral regulation applies to all things, right? We know that kids with ADHD have trouble with this, but I would imagine you may be able to tell us that those kids who are sort of allowed to engage in this risky play that's so beneficial, my guess is that they go on to develop better behavioral regulation, right? They have that moment of fear or anxiety, and they know how to sort of bring themselves back down, and that this is going to be okay. Versus if that fear or anxiety is invoked by something else that's not risky play, and they don't have this experience with risky play, then they don't have those skills to sort of self-regulate for that other thing. Is anyone researching that? I'm curious.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's all
Okay.
related to the same idea. We need to do more work with kids with special needs or neurodiversions and stuff.
Hmm.
The work that's been available shows that, if anything, the need for this is amplified, right?
Hmm.
And so, when I talked about the microdosing of risky play and the microdosing of uncertainty, the world is uncertain. We're surrounded by uncertainty everywhere all the time, and lots of decisions we need to make every day around the risk that we're willing to take. And so if we shield children from these experiences, then how are they going to learn how to manage the stimuli that will surround them around the world every day, to feel confident in themselves, in their ability to manage that? And also, very importantly, when we return to the idea that you could get injured or hurt during this kind of experience, it's also important to have those adverse experiences, because you realize, okay, not that big a deal, totally manageable, and that it's not the end of the world, and you could, the sky didn't fall down on your head, kind of thing, right? And so you talked about the social emotional learning. Thrill and excitement is a very, very strong emotion. And you do need to kind of, when you're flooded with that, understand that is a positive thing that you can lean into, and that you can manage, right? That it's not going to be so overwhelming that kids can't manage it, right? And so again, it's the microdosing of these experiences that build the skills for kids, no matter their background, their experience, their needs. Every child needs this. It's just going to look different for different kids.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, one of the things that we talk about on the podcast is this active play every day, right? And we know that only 1 in 4 children gets 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous activity or active play a day in this country. So many of those moments are being, if you will, sort of stolen away by sedentary screen time, and the fact that recess is only, 15 to 20 minutes in some schools. And so, parents probably need to be very deliberate in allowing for these types of experiences for their children. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So we've learned that risk taking is really how the brain learns consequences in real life. As parents, I'm a parent of 3 young children. I feel that really my primary responsibility is to keep them safe. And then probably secondary is to allow for their optimal development. But if I don't keep them safe first, they're not going to develop very far. And so I think every parent feels that way. And so talk us through, how do we think about risky play on one hand, where we know it's so important for development, and then a hazard. And what is the difference between risk and hazard, and how should parents approach both? And maybe you could give us some examples of this is, risky play for a toddler, an elementary school, high schooler, and versus a hazard. I think that would be helpful for folks to hear.
This is a really important concept in terms of kind of differentiating between risk and hazard. And in some ways, it's an artificial separation, but it's a way that people can kind of get their brain around it a bit easier. And so, just to be clear, you talked about how important it is as a parent to feel you're keeping your kids safe. But when we look at the injury stats, I mean, the point is that this is actually not that. It's not that unsafe, right? When you look at the things that cause the most serious injuries and deaths, play is not one of those things at all. And even in terms of what causes injury-related hospitalizations, when you look at the time spent doing the activity, sports is something that causes more injury-related hospitalizations than play. And so even from a injury statistics perspective, while it's hard for parents to get their head around, it really isn't that big a deal. Now, in terms of the difference between a risk and a hazard, so we think about hazards as things that kids might not have the lived experience, the developmental stage to be able to potentially identify and or manage. And so this could be things like broken equipment, glass on the playground, those kinds of things. Or if your space is near a busy road, thinking about separating children from traffic and making sure that they don't wander into traffic as they're playing. Those kinds of things are things that we encourage adults to think about when they look at the play space and do kind of a risk-benefit assessment. Where are the places that there could be, I know my child best, what are some of the challenges for them, and how can I think about those? So then that environment is still, the child can make their own decisions around the risk they want to engage in. So risks, you're really retaining the children's agency and ability to make those decisions. And hazards, you're managing. You're never going to be able to get rid of them all. You're managing them, and even as much as possible, you're involving the children in that hazard management so that they are also having experiences in identifying them and figuring out how to manage them.
Yeah, 100% agree. Give us an example of a toddler, what maybe your favorite risky play activity is, or one that you think is really leads to a lot of development, maybe for each age group, to give parents examples of. And I have a few of my own, but I'm curious what you would say too.
Well, one of the things we shy away from is we don't tend to have like this age, this activity. Partly because even kids of the same age can have very different levels of comfort and development and so on. If you have a child who's got lots of experience climbing things, they're going to be able to, do something more challenging than, say, a child who doesn't have those experiences. And so we really want parents to pay attention and to they know their children best. They understand their children best, and they're really best placed to figure out what would work best for their kids. So where we do the work that we do is how can we create environments with a lot of affordances for play. So whether you're, a toddler who tends to not, be a bit more risk averse, all the way to a teenager who's a sensation seeker, how can you make sure that there are things that fit the need for all of those kinds of play experiences? And often this involves the availability of loose parts, things that can move around and children can shape the play. And when I talk about loose parts, it's things like sticks, mud, rocks, water, sand, boxes. Snow is like the best loose part ever, those kinds of things. Yeah.
So many parents are horrified when their kid goes up a tree, and as a pediatric emergency medicine doc, I just don't see that many kids who show up having fallen out of a tree. I see more who have fallen off of the monkey bars. And I have, as I mentioned, 2 sets of monkey bars in my front yard, actually, even knowing that this is somewhat risky and my kids take risks on them, but they're learning progressively. And as you mentioned, there's this sort of intuition of, I'm going to take this a little further. And they seem to do very well with that. However, even myself, my son especially, who I've talked about before on the podcast, he's turning 8 soon, and he is a risk taker, just and a sensory seeker, and pretty athletic, and one of these kids that's been taking risk his whole life and engaging in risky play, and has developed a lot of physical skills, and pretty much knows where he should stop. However, he is the one where there are those moments where I'm right at that verge of, do I yell out, be careful, or do I hold back and pause? And so how do you coach parents? How should they think about this? When do they yell out? When do they hold back? What would you say?
Heck, I've even found be careful coming out of my mouth, like, no, don't say that. So, be careful is the most useless safety advice ever, if you want to think about it that way. It doesn't convey to the child what they should be aware of. It just conveys to them your anxiety and a vague sense of they're worried for me, and so they don't trust me to actually figure this out for myself. And even at worse, it could distract them in terms of what am I missing, right? And then there actually could be an injury hazard at that point in time, right? So even from that perspective, try not to say be careful. But you can certainly, so where we encourage parents, we have what we call the 17-second rule. So when you want to say be careful, that you just count to 17 to really allow, because, in the brain we have the fast thinking and the slow thinking. And the fast thinking is really what we do most of the time just because we need to get through the day and there's lots of stuff coming at us. But it's shortcut thinking, and it's very sensitive to our emotions. And so when we're in that kind of be careful mode, it's our emotions flooding our body and not allowing us to have kind of decisions that would be a bit more objectively helpful in the situation. And so the counting to 17 just allows things to slow down a bit and be like, and for you to in some ways collect data around, okay, how's it going? Are they managing? If something goes wrong, is this a life and limb situation? Like, are they really in danger? Or is it like, oh, well, they'll get a scrape or, whatever, and no big deal, and they learn from it. And so that's really what we encourage parents to do. But you can also, if you're, getting back to the idea of hazards, you can also kind of still empowering the child, help them identify those hazards. So things like, hey, what route do you plan to take up that tree? Or what's your next move? If you notice, for example, that there's a branch that looks a bit, iffy, you could help them see that and point it out. You could get insights into what they're thinking. You could, if they have a big stick, do you have, where are you going to swing that? Do you have enough space? Is there anybody around? Those kinds of things, right? Rather than be careful.
Yeah, I love it. 100% agree. In 17 seconds, I love that suggestion. And it probably turns out to be 10 by the time you're in this mental state that, it's probably 3/4 of a second for every actual second as you're counting. And so taking that moment as a parent to pause, assess, ask a useful question where they'll help the kid develop and assess their own risk and make their own plan. And certainly safety, if you need to yell out, if your kid's about to step into the road and there's a car coming, absolutely yell out. That is not what we're talking about here. Just for everyone listening, we're talking about allowing risky play to happen so that kids can develop optimally, and how as a parent to take those moments to stay calm and take that step.
And when you look at actually injury deaths resulting from falls from trees, we have data from across the entire country from 2000 through 2022. That's 23 years. There has been zero, not one death of a child falling from a tree, right? And you compare that to kids as passengers in cars, where you have well over 2,000.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. So we know in the US, the number one cause of death is firearms. And second is motor vehicle collisions, preventable causes of death. And I can't say that I've ever had a child seriously injured falling from a tree. And organized sports, definitely, but it's many children play organized sports. It's a great thing to do. There is some risk of injury, period. I trained in Colorado and practiced in Colorado for a while, and we saw a lot of skiing injuries, and some of those were very serious, right? However, they can be prevented by following the rules, wearing a helmet, and taking the right safety precautions. So most of what we've been talking about with risky play today, they aren't the types of risky play where you're going to need to wear a piece of safety equipment. This is stuff you can do out in the forest. But if you are sort of broadening your definition of risky play, and it's sort of even some of these other organized things that have risks, then make sure you're following, the best practices in safety. And then the risk becomes much lower.
We've done a lot of research with kids and where they like to play and what's important to them. These are kids like very young, 3-year-olds all the way to 13. Trees just come up again and again and again, right? We really do have an affinity for trees, and for good reason.
I'm imagining, some of our listeners are going to live in a city, right? Or maybe they live somewhere, Colorado, for example. Certain parts of Colorado are more like desert, and there are fields. There aren't a lot of trees actually in certain areas, and not the type you'd want to climb. How can parents sort of seek out opportunity for these areas, as you said, with loose parts, these sort of nature areas, when they may live in an inner city and it's not super available? What are your ideas for those parents?
Yeah, and this is a big challenge. We spend a lot of time thinking about reducing inequities around this because, as you say, we do know that for some parents and some families, they don't have access to this kind of play, and that the areas that are near them aren't actually that safe. And so we are doing more and more work with childcare in schools, looking at the places where kids already spend their time so that we can improve those spaces. And then if you do improve the play affordances in a school, for example, many parents will have that close by. And the schools we've seen that do this most successfully, those materials are still available on the weekends and evenings that kids, families can come by and use them and still be able to access them. But in terms of nature looks very different in different places, and you don't need the beautiful forest or the mountains or whatever to be able to benefit from it. It really, even a dandelion growing from a sidewalk is nature and is just as important.
You have a new book coming out. And are you able to tell us a little bit about it? And the reason why I'm segueing here is I heard you talk about schools, and I think that's one of the main topics of the book. And tell us, without telling us too much, because hopefully we can have you back and talk more in depth, but tell us a little bit about how you think of the school environment and what your suggestions are there. A couple of top suggestions for any teachers or educators who might be listening.
Yeah, absolutely. We're getting more and more into this work. And here I have to do a shout out to my colleague, Megan Zenny, who did her PhD on this and really dug deep into what does it look like for the teachers who take their kids outside to learn. And how do you think about risky play and the potential for teaching in those contexts? So our book is called Embracing Risky Play at School, and it's going to be out January 23rd. And what we have in there is really the first part is the research. Why is this so important? Not just for the kids and their development and their learning and their well-being, but actually also for the teachers. It contributes to their development or their well-being, and it also has a big impact on the relationship that kids and teachers have with each other. So rather than it being a supervisory kind of policing relationship, it's much more nurturing for both of them. And Megan has been a teacher in the school district for over 20 years. She has immense practical experience, and she does a lot of professional development with teachers in very different contexts, and including the US. And so she has those really practical tips and tricks, the yeah buts, that she can answer. So we dig deep into that in the book. And then we also, on our website at outsideplay.org, have a free tool for teachers to access, with little micro videos around the key topics that teachers who do this work were like, I wish I had known this when I started. And they share, this is how I overcame that, or this is how I do this, or this is how I do that. There is a tool for parents on there, and a tool for early childhood educators, and these are tools that we've done extensive research on. We use behavior change theory. We've done randomized control trials on their effectiveness. And so the tool for parents is really helping parents think differently about this, just asking some guided questions to support their reflection. Even simple things like, we really want people to start by identifying their core values. And so in the case of parents, it's like, what do I really want from my child when they grow up? And are they having the kinds of experiences that they need to foster what I think is this core value? And then we take them through a series of other steps to kind of make us, to challenge their assumptions around risk and risk taking, and to make sure that what they're doing aligns with what they value the most.
That's a fantastic resource. And earlier we talked about, those parents who may be the ones that are really don't wait those whole 17 seconds and are very nervous about this type of risky play. And I imagine those are the parents who, going through these exercises, they can really sort of develop their mindset so that their own children are allowed to have more risk. Because one of the things I imagine, and maybe you could tell us, is that this is almost generational, right? So if that parent's parent, spoke up and didn't allow a ton of risk, then they're less likely to allow in their own children, and so on. And so I imagine there are going to be parents listening who understand the value of this, but find it very hard. And so visiting your website again, which is in the show notes below, and going through this type of work would be a great place to start.
Yeah, and what I want to make it clear, like, we want to empower parents to do things differently, but we want parents to stop blaming themselves. It's not your fault. This really is, you're swimming in a culture of risk aversion, and this is something that has developed over several decades, starting in the 80s. And so, as you mentioned with generational, we've seen that different generations of children have had different realities in terms of how they grow up and what they're allowed to do and so on. And so certainly for someone like me who grew up in the 70s and 80s, it was very, very different, very much
Yes.
get out of the house and don't come home until the streetlights come on, which
That's right.
seems unheard of, at this point in time. And yet we were still kids, and kids are very competent and capable, but it was the society and the assumptions around us that have changed over time. And it can be very difficult as a parent, like you're really swimming upstream around this tidal wave of, opinions around how you should parent and what it means to be a good parent. And that's really hard. And so again, that's why with our tool, we really want them to focus on the values, their core values. It doesn't matter what they are. They don't have to be my values or your values. It's really that parent's core values that can guide them as the North Star, the thing that they can keep in mind when they're experiencing that kind of feeling of swimming upstream and the thoughts from other parents or whoever is passing judgment. Yeah, but this is really a core thing that's important to me and that I want for my child, and it can help them kind of move things forward. And the other thing that can help a lot is to find a community of other like-minded parents. Even better if they live close by, because you can create kind of this little microcosm in your neighborhood around, kids being able to have some of the experiences that used to be quite common when we were growing up. But certainly just feeling like there are others out there who think like you and who have experienced the same things, so you can share your ideas, your challenges, and so on. And this is something we encourage for teachers, early childhood educators, really everyone.
A parent may be listening right now, for example, and they say, you know what? I want to start working on this with my child. And let's just say their child is 8 or 9 years old. And up until this point, maybe both the child at this point and the parent are sort of conservative in terms of the amount of risky play they may engage in. And they go to a school in the United States, let's say, and there's not a lot of risk that happens at this school either. So how does that parent sort of encourage their child to start engaging more in risky play when maybe sort of the first years of their life, they've been much more conservative?
Yeah, and what we want to recognize is that this is a journey. It's not a sudden change, right? And so you can't go from, for example, your child has never been, out in the front yard or backyard by themselves, all the way to they're walking to school on their own.
Right.
You really have to think about this as very small steps. And the first, and in our parent tool, the very end is like, make a plan for change, but make sure that it is so mindlessly easy that it doesn't feel daunting at all. And so, for example, the 17-second rule is an example, and that might be too daunting for some people. Take it down to 5 seconds. It doesn't matter, right? But the idea being that you start somewhere that is so easy that you're like, I could do that. Like I could do that today. And then maybe tomorrow it's 10 seconds and also that, where I think is really important to understand is parents aren't there to encourage risky play. They are there to help create the conditions where kids can decide for themselves whether they want to engage in risky play. And to your point, in terms of, some kids might be risk averse and we might want to encourage them to explore things. That might be a clinical issue. Maybe they need to see someone like my colleague Helen Dodd, around anxiety to help them kind of, again, do that little cognitive behavioral therapy on their own. But for most kids, it really is just how do we foster a positive relationship, a trusting relationship between the parents and the children. And it has, it's going to be gradual. Again, if you've done things one way, it takes everybody time to adjust and do things differently. And as that your child is noticing too, that you are leaving more of the decisions in their hands, they see the trust. It's because right now the way we kind of operate as a default in society is that children are incapable and incompetent. And they need an adult around constantly to tell them what to do and how to do it. That is a very stifling and, as a developmental psychologist, I can say a very harmful way to grow up. And so they're surrounded by that, not just, potentially at home. Maybe home isn't like that, but they're surrounded by that at school and everywhere else. And so building that kind of culture of trust and respect that kids can then thrive in, where like, oh, my parent thinks that I'm capable and competent, and so I can start to explore some of these things on my own.
100% agree that your kid will be happier for it. You'll eventually be happy for it, even if it makes you a bit nervous, and they'll develop optimally. And there is a ton of benefit in the brain, but also physically in terms of their sort of, we call this the health span, right? And building the muscles and the flexibility and the mobility that's going to last them a lifetime. Really, it starts in childhood.
We talked in the beginning about we want to keep our kids safe, right? We see that as our primary kind of role as parents. And in fact, what we have learned about risky play is that keeping kids safe means letting them take risks. And so not only from the perspective that actually injuries are very rare, but also from, I talked about the microdosing. It's also the building of skills around risk management, right? And not just physical risk management, stuff in the physical environment, but also cognitive and emotional risk management, and them kind of getting those experiences with doing that for themselves that then translate to other situations. And in fact, we have new research where we've proven that kids' performance or risky play experiences impact how well they cross a street. And so it's such important skills to build in early childhood. These things don't come online when they're 18 and going off to university and no parents are around. What we've seen in the literature and the research is that kids, overprotected, haven't had these experiences, then are off on their own without adults telling them what to do, and they really flounder because they don't know how to manage this.
Yeah. And I just want to repeat that. So allowing risky play actually keeps kids safe. And there's research, which we'll probably put in the show notes, about they can more safely cross a street if allowed to engage in risky play. And that's the environment that they're raised in. And so it's very counterintuitive, right? This sort of like overbearing parenting culture that especially seems to be present in the United States at times, or has at least shifted from our childhood, right? It's very different now, where we stayed out till the lights came on, and then we went home and ate dinner, and we were doing all sorts of risky play that our parents had no idea about. And, we still arrived home and all in one piece, maybe with a scrape on our knee, right? Or some mud in our hair. But, we arrived home and we were better for it. And so helping parents and caregivers to find those ways for children to shift back more towards that, because we know it's so good and we have lots of research to prove it, which we'll put some of that in the show notes, is the point of today's episode. This is awesome.
Parents describe like three big fears around their challenges with allowing risky play. The first by far is kidnapping, right? That their kid will get abducted by someone. And of course, this relates more to if their kid is off independently, right? Sure. Not when they're being supervised. The second is things like cars, right? So their kid's getting hit by a car. And the third is the judgment of other parents, or say having social services called or the police called because their kid is kind of wandering on their own. Kind of keeping with our earlier theme about how bad we are with our objective sense of where the risks are. In terms of abduction by a stranger, in Canada, the stats are a likelihood of 1 in 14 million. It's so very, very rare that you're just about as likely to win our national lottery as to have your child abducted by a stranger. And at some point, somebody wrote a book which they estimated that you would have to be left outside on your own for 200,000 years, to log the time to, for a stranger to decide, it's just a vanishingly rare likelihood. And yet it looms like a dark cloud over parents and really influences their decisions. And even when we tell them it's like one, like it's so rare, they're like, yes, but you're still one, right? And I don't want that to be my kid. And that's where we talk about, well, think about the things that you have to do or that society is doing to avoid these very unlikely events, including falling from trees or whatever, and balance that with what we are increasingly understanding is the very negative impacts of that kind of restrictive, safety first, as safe as possible approach.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so easy to get caught up in that anxiety as a caregiver. And then you were mentioning also the parental judgment. So other parents potentially judging you on allowing more risky play and more risk. How do you coach parents to think about that?
And that's a really hard one. And that's, it's hard to, as I said, swim upstream when you have a culture that's telling you to do things one way. And that's where we find it helpful for the parents to kind of really dig into their values and what's more important to them, to identify that North Star that helps them block out all of the noise that's telling them to do things a certain way, and to find peers, others who think like them, who they can just vent to, or share thoughts, share challenges, etc. That can give you a real sense of support as you're going through these and trying to do things differently.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think the third one was cars. And
Yeah.
so we already know that risky play helps you cross the street, or we're about to know that as soon as your manuscript is published. And we'll put it in the show notes. But how should parents consider that risk?
Yeah, well, that's really interesting, right? Because one of the ways that parents keep their kids safe, is by putting them in cars and driving them around. Not letting them walk or bike to certain places. And yes, as we had mentioned earlier, the leading cause of death in Canada, and your second leading cause of death in the US, is children as passengers in cars. And so
Hmm.
we are actively doing the thing that is most likely to put our kids at risk of death in order to keep them safe, right? And so that really is, it's counterintuitive for parents, but if you follow the stats, it is safer for them not to be in cars. And of course, you don't want to just kind of, they've never walked around your neighborhood and you're kind of letting them loose. There are, you need to build those skills over time, and both of you need to be comfortable in how they manage that. But really, it is to think, like, really flip our thinking upside down and understand that what the things that we do that we think are keeping kids safe are actually not the case.
Yeah, absolutely. And understanding your environment, right? So, we're definitely going to have an episode, and once it's recorded, we'll put it in the show notes as well, about this concept of a bike bus that's developing, where parents can get together and, kind of in a group, allow their kids to bike to school, if that's, the supervision they may need to get there safely in your neighborhood. And then you extrapolate that into areas of Europe that have this biking infrastructure that's so well done, and there are kids who bike everywhere on their own, in certain countries, and they're better for it. The data shows they're happier, they're more resilient, they have lower levels of anxiety, they learn better. We have a lot of data to suggest that that's the way to do it. Let's finish up with every episode. I do a prescription, active play every day. If you were to write a prescription with me, to the kids who are listening and the families, that they need to do active, risky play every day, what are sort of the top three things that we're going to put in this prescription for them to think about to get there?
Well, I would say, trust themselves is the first thing, right? And really dig into the fact that, they know their child, and they shouldn't be worried about thinking about what they need and their child needs, and block out all that noise. The second thing is understand that you start small. Don't make huge leaps. And for example, the 17-second rule could be really helpful for some parents in terms of the first step in this journey. And the third is to trust your child, right? And really lean into watching how they manage things, and fostering an environment where you can build that trust in each other.
I love it. So to review the three things on the active play everyday risky play prescription: trust yourself, trust your child, and start small. I love it. And more in the show notes. Visit for all of the resources. And Dr. Mariana Brussoni, I cannot thank you enough. This has been a super fun episode. For more tips, resources, and show notes, visit activeplayeveryday.com. And if you found this episode helpful, please help us out by rating and reviewing the show from wherever you're listening. It really helps other families find us. Until next time, consider this your active play prescription, because play isn't extra, it's essential.